She dropped to her knees on a frozen Detroit sidewalk, her bare hands pressing against a stranger's chest, counting compressions out loud while the wind cut through her scrubs like a blade. She didn't think about being late. She didn't think about her job. She thought about the heartbeat that wasn't there, and she refused to accept it. That split-second decision to stop and save a life would cost Sarah Bennett everything she had worked for. And none of it would matter until a black military helicopter split open the sky above her apartment 3 days later. If this story moves you, hit subscribe right now and drop your city in the comments. I want to see how far this story travels. The morning Sarah Bennett's life fell apart started like every other morning in Detroit in February, cold gray and indifferent. She was already 12 minutes late when she turned the corner onto Larned Street. Her shift at Riverside Memorial Hospital started at 6:30 sharp, and her supervisor, charge nurse Patricia Hollins, had made it abundantly clear at their last staff meeting that tardiness was no longer a gray area. It was a disciplinary matter. It was documented. It was a strike. Sarah knew all of this. She was walking fast, her breath coming out in little white clouds, her bag hitched high on her shoulder, her mind already running through the patient charts. She'd need to pull the moment she clocked in. She was doing the mental math 12 minutes. Maybe she could make it 14 if she moved fast enough. Patricia might not have finished rounds yet. Maybe she could slip in through the side entrance near the supply dock. And then she heard it, a sound that stopped her cold. Not a crash, not a scream, something quieter than that. Something that every nurse, every medic, every person who has ever worked in a trauma unit learns to recognize at a cellular level the sound of a body going wrong. It was a soft, wet gasp, followed by the dull, horrible thud of dead weight hitting concrete. Sarah spun around. A woman had collapsed on the sidewalk, not 20 feet behind her. She was older, maybe mid-60s, dressed in a good coat, the kind that said she hadn't grown up poor, and she was down hard on her side, one arm twisted beneath her, her face already going slack in a way that made Sarah's stomach drop straight through the pavement. Sarah didn't hesitate. She didn't pause. She didn't think about Patricia Hollins or the disciplinary file or the mandatory certification exam she'd already missed once this quarter. Her body moved before her brain caught up the way it had been trained to move, first in nursing school, then in the Army, then in 12 years of floor work at Riverside Memorial. She was on her knees beside the woman before anyone else on the sidewalk had even turned to look. Ma'am, can you hear me?" She pressed 2 fingers to the woman's neck. Nothing. Then there, faint as a whisper, a pulse. Weak and irregular skipping beats like a record with a scratch. "Somebody call 911 right now." Sarah barked it over her shoulder without looking up. "Tell them possible cardiac event, Larned, and third, tell them to move fast." She heard shuffling behind her, murmuring, someone fumbling with a phone. The woman's lips were going blue at the edges. Her chest wasn't rising right. "Come on," Sarah said quietly, tilting the woman's chin back, opening the airway. "Come on, stay with me." She worked for 11 minutes on that frozen sidewalk. 11 minutes is a long time when you're kneeling on concrete in February. 11 minutes is an eternity when you're watching someone's color drain away, and the only thing standing between them and the other side is your training and your willingness to keep going. Sarah gave rescue breaths. She monitored the pulse. She spoke to the woman in a low, steady voice, not because she thought the woman could necessarily hear her, but because she'd learned long ago that the voice matters. The voice is an anchor. It says you are not alone. Someone is here. Someone is fighting for you. "You're going to be okay," Sarah told her, "that help is on. You just have to hold on." A small crowd had gathered by now, a few people recording on their phones, a man in a business suit standing with his hands in his pockets, looking pale and useless, a teenager who had gotten off his bike and was hovering uncertainly at the edge of the circle. "Is she dead?" the teenager asked. "No," Sarah said flatly. "Back up and give her air." When the paramedics finally arrived, Sarah gave them a rapid, precise handoff vitals timeline, what she'd observed, what she'd done. She used the language of someone who had done this 100 times because she had. The lead paramedic, a stocky man with a red beard, looked at her as they were loading the woman onto the gurney. "You a doctor, nurse," Sarah said. "Riverside Memorial." "Good catch," he said. "Another few minutes and—" He shook his head instead of finishing the sentence. He didn't need to. Sarah stood up. Her knees were stiff. Her scrubs had a dark, wet patch from the sidewalk. Her hands were shaking slightly from the adrenaline dump, the way they always did after a crisis, not during, never during, but always after, when the body finally allowed itself to feel what it had been holding at bay. She looked at her phone. She was now 29 minutes late. She started walking toward the hospital. Patricia Hollins was waiting at the entrance. Not at the nurse's station, not in the break room. At the actual entrance, standing by the front doors, in her dark blue charge nurse scrubs, her arms crossed, her expression set in that particular configuration that experienced hospital staff learned to read immediately. This is not a conversation. This is a verdict. Sarah, Patricia's voice was measured, controlled, the kind of control that takes effort. I know I'm late, Sarah said, already moving past her toward the locker room. I need to explain. Stop. Patricia's hand came up. My office? Now. Sarah stopped. She turned. She looked at Patricia's face and understood that whatever she said in the next few minutes was going to matter enormously. Patricia, I had a medical situation on the street. A woman collapsed. I provided emergency stabilization until EMS arrived. I documented the time. I can give you the exact my office, Patricia repeated. Quiet, final. The office was small, institutional, the kind of room designed to make conversations feel official and permanent. Patricia sat behind the desk. Sarah sat across from it. Do you know what today was? Patricia asked. Sarah felt something shift in her chest. She knew. She'd known for 3 weeks. The recertification exam. Your second missed recertification exam, Patricia said. The first one, we gave you an extension. We documented it. We gave you the new date. Today was the new date. I had a patient emergency. You had a situation on the street, Patricia said, and the slight emphasis on street was precise and surgical. Not in this hospital, not with one of our patients. You made a personal decision to intervene in a situation on a public sidewalk, and as a result, you missed a mandatory certification requirement and arrived at your shift 30 minutes late. I saved her life, Patricia. That's not... Patricia stopped herself, took a breath. When she spoke again, her voice was quieter, and Sarah could hear something in it that sounded almost like conflict. That's not what this is about, Sarah. Then what is it about? Compliance, protocol. The hospital has standards, and those standards exist for a reason, and when staff members operate outside of those standards, it creates liability. For the hospital, for the patients, for everyone. Sarah stared at her. A woman was dying on the sidewalk, and paramedics were called. That is the protocol for a civilian medical emergency. There were no paramedics. There was no one. There was me. Patricia's jaw tightened. You are being placed on suspension pending a formal review. The words landed like something physical. Sarah was quiet for a moment. When she spoke, her voice was very careful. Patricia, I need you to hear what you're saying to me. You're suspending me for stopping to save a woman's life. I'm suspending you for missing a mandatory certification and chronic tardiness. This is the 4th incident in 8 months. 3 of those incidents involve patient care situations. The process exists, Sarah. Patricia's voice had gone flat again. Closed. You know the process. If you felt you needed to intervene, you should have called it in, requested coverage, followed the chain of... She would have been dead in 3 minutes. Sarah's voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. The steadiness of it was its own kind of force. You understand that she would have been dead. There was no time for a chain of command. There was a woman and there was me, and she needed help. Patricia looked at her for a long moment. Go home, Sarah, she said. You'll be contacted about the review. Sarah drove home in silence. She didn't play the radio. She didn't call anyone. She sat with both hands on the wheel and stared at the road and let the thing that had happened settle into her bones the way bad news always does, not all at once, but in layers like cold working its way through a coat. She had worked at Riverside Memorial for 9 years. She had been a nurse for 12. Before that, she had spent 6 years in the United States Army as a combat medic, 2 tours, one of which had taken her to places she still didn't talk about at dinner tables. She had worked under conditions that made a February sidewalk in Detroit look like a warm afternoon. She had kept people alive in circumstances that would have broken most people entirely. And now she was suspended for it. She parked in the lot of her apartment building and sat in the car for a while. Through the windshield, she watched a pigeon navigate the concrete ledge above the entrance. She thought about the woman on the sidewalk. She didn't even know her name. I hope you made it, she thought. I really hope you made it. Her phone buzzed. She looked at it. Unknown number, Detroit area code. She answered it. Miss Bennett. The voice was professional, female, careful in the way that lawyers are careful, every word accounted for. My name is Janet Reyes. I'm calling on behalf of the administration of Riverside Memorial Hospital. I've been asked to inform you that your suspension has been elevated to a termination pending the outcome of a formal disciplinary hearing. You'll receive paperwork at your registered address within 72 hours. Sarah felt the air go out of the car. Termination, she said. Yes, ma'am, effective as of this morning's incident. I saved a woman's life this morning. There was a half beat of silence on the other end, just long enough to tell Sarah that Janet Reyes was human and that somewhere underneath the professional voice there was a person who understood what was being said. The hospital's position, Janet said carefully, is that the circumstances of this morning do not mitigate the pattern of non-compliance that has been documented in your file. Pattern, Sarah repeated. Ms. Bennett, I want to be clear that this call is a notification, not a conversation. You will receive full documentation. I don't want documentation, Sarah said. I want someone to explain to me how a hospital fires someone for stopping to save a life on the way to work. Another pause. You'll receive the paperwork, Janet Reyes said, and the line went dead. That night, Sarah sat at her kitchen table with her bills spread out in front of her. Rent, utilities. The car payment she'd been 2 weeks behind on since November. The student loan that had followed her like a shadow for the better part of a decade. Her mother's supplemental insurance, which Sarah had been quietly helping cover for the past 3 years without telling anyone. She was 44 years old. She had 2 degrees, a combat service ribbon, 12 years of nursing experience, and as of this morning, no job. She thought about calling her friend Donna, who worked in the ER at Detroit Receiving, and had been telling her for 2 years to get out of Riverside Memorial, that the administration there was rotten, that the culture had been shifting in ways that had nothing to do with patient care, and everything to do with cutting costs and managing liability. I told you, Donna would say, not unkindly, but she would say it. Sarah wasn't ready to hear it tonight. She looked at the bills. She looked at her phone. She looked at the corner of her living room where her Army service photograph hung. In a plain black frame, a group of people in desert camo, squinting into a sun that had no mercy in it. Arms around each other, the way people put their arms around each other when they have been through something that cannot be fully explained to anyone who wasn't there. She was second from the left, 28 years old, thin and strong and alive in a way that had very little to do with comfort and everything to do with purpose. She had known even then that she was going to spend her life doing this, putting her hands on people who were broken and staying until they were less broken. It was not a decision she had made. It was a thing she was, and Riverside Memorial had just told her that thing was a liability. The next 2 days passed in the particular misery of forced idleness. Sarah was not a person built for stillness. She cleaned her apartment twice. She reorganized the kitchen cabinets in a way that made no meaningful difference but took 2 hours. She went for a run in the cold and pushed herself too hard and came back with her lungs burning and her mind no quieter than when she'd left. She called the hospital's HR department on the second day and was told the review was ongoing. She looked up labor attorneys online and got discouraged by the consultation fees. She thought about reaching out to former colleagues at the hospital, nurses who had worked beside her for years, who knew her record, who had seen her in action, but something held her back. She didn't want to make things complicated for them. The administration had a long memory. She'd seen what happened to people who made noise. On the evening of the second day, she got a call from a number she didn't recognize. She almost didn't answer it. She was tired of calls from people with professional voices delivering bad news in measured language. But she answered it. Sarah Bennett. The voice was male, deep, and familiar in a way that took her brain 3 full seconds to place, not because she'd forgotten it, but because it belonged so completely to a different chapter of her life, that hearing it in her kitchen, standing in front of an open refrigerator in sweatpants, felt momentarily surreal. Morrison, she said. The one and only, said Army Captain David Morrison. And she could hear the smile in it, the same grin that had gotten them all through some very dark nights, the smile of a man who thought problems were fundamentally solvable if you refused to accept that they weren't. How are you holding up, Bennett? Sarah closed the refrigerator. She sat down on the kitchen floor, her back against the cabinet, because her legs had gone slightly unreliable. How do you know? She asked. Detroit's not that big, Morrison said, and I still have friends in that city. One of them happened to have a friend on the EMS crew that responded to Larned Street yesterday morning. A pause. You keeping it together? I'm sitting on my kitchen floor, Sarah said. That's not an answer. I know. Listen to me. His voice shifted slightly, not harder exactly, but more deliberate. She recognized that too. It was his operational voice. The one he used when things mattered and there was no time for anything but the truth. You need to stay put. You need to stay calm. And you need to trust that what you did has not gone unnoticed. Morrison, I'm fired. I'm not deployed. I don't need a mission brief. No, he said, but you might need backup. Another pause. Sit tight, Bennett. That's all I'm asking. She stared at the kitchen tile. What are you not telling me? She'd asked. More than I can get into on the phone. Just sit tight. And then quieter. You did the right thing. Out there on that sidewalk. I need you to hold on to that. The line went quiet. Sarah sat on her kitchen floor for a long time after that, her phone in her lap, the apartment silent around her, except for the sound of the city doing what cities do, humming and grinding, and moving forward without asking anyone's permission. She didn't know what David Morrison was talking about. She didn't know that the woman she had saved on the sidewalk that Tuesday morning was Victoria Hall, wife of Edward Hall, one of the largest private donors in Riverside Memorial's history, a man whose name was on the cardiac wing, whose money had funded 2 research initiatives and a patient care endowment, a man who had spent the last 48 hours sitting in a hospital room holding his wife's hand while she recovered from the cardiac event that would have killed her, that had killed her briefly, technically, on a frozen Detroit sidewalk until a nurse with bare hands and 12 years of experience and 6 years of combat medicine refused to let her go. She didn't know that Edward Hall had spent the last 12 hours making phone calls. She didn't know that Morrison wasn't calling from Detroit. She didn't know that the sound she would hear in 36 hours, a deep rhythmic thudding that would rattle her apartment windows and bring half her neighbors out into the parking lot, was already in motion. She sat on her kitchen floor and she breathed and she held onto what Morrison had told her to hold on to. You did the right thing. That was enough. For now, it had to be enough. On the morning of the 3rd day, Sarah woke to the sound of her neighbor, Mrs. Petrakis, pounding on the wall they shared. Not the irritated knock that meant Sarah's TV was too loud, but the rapid, frantic knock that meant something was happening. Sarah was at the window before she was fully awake. In the parking lot below her apartment building, a helicopter was landing. Not a news helicopter, not a police helicopter. A black military-grade UH-60, its rotors cutting the February morning into something that felt nothing at all like ordinary life. Its presence in that parking lot so completely outside the logic of Sarah Bennett's world that for 3 full seconds she simply stood at the window and stared, unable to make her brain accept what her eyes were sending it. And then the door opened, and a woman stepped out. Sarah recognized her immediately, not from ever having met her, but from the news stories about the cardiac wing dedication from the donor galas she'd seen photographed in the hospital newsletter, from the framed portrait in the hospital lobby that she had walked past 9,000 times in 9 years. Victoria Hall, alive, standing. Moving towards Sarah's building with 2 military officers flanking on her, and a man in a gray suit carrying a leather briefcase who had the very specific posture of someone who had spent a great deal of his professional life walking into rooms where serious things were about to happen. Sarah's phone rang. Morrison. Look out your window, he said, and she could hear just barely the rhythmic sound of the rotors in the background of his call. I'm looking, Sarah said. Good, Morrison said. Now go open your door. She had done the right thing, and the right thing, the thing that had cost her everything, was standing in her parking lot, ready to give it all back. Orchestrated, fast-paced narrative with dialogue twists and emotional depth. Orchestrated, fast-paced narrative with dialogue twists and emotional depth. Sarah's hand was on the doorknob before the knock came. She had heard the footsteps in the hallway. Firm measured the kind of footsteps that belong to people who are accustomed to walking into situations that other people walk away from. She had straightened her sweatshirt without thinking about it, the way a soldier straightens before a superior officer enters the room, muscle memory from a life she thought she had mostly left behind. Then the knock. 3 times, deliberate, she opened the door. Victoria Hall was shorter than Sarah had expected. In the hospital newsletter photographs and the lobby portrait, she had always seemed like someone who took up more space than ordinary people, the way wealthy, powerful people sometimes do, the aura of consequence preceding them into every room. In person, standing in the narrow hallway of Sarah's apartment building, in a wool coat with her dark hair pulled back and her eyes still carrying the particular fragility of someone who had recently been very close to dying, she looked like a woman. Just a woman. 63 years old and alive when she might not have been, and fully aware of the difference. Behind her stood 2 officers in uniform, 1 Army, 1 Marine, their faces professionally composed. Beside them, the man in the gray suit with the briefcase. And at the far end of the hallway, just turning the corner, with a grin already forming, David Morrison. Victoria looked at Sarah for a moment without speaking. Then she said, "You have no idea who I am, do you?" It wasn't a question. It was said quietly with something almost like wonder in it. "I know who you are," Sarah said. "Mrs. Hall." Victoria blinked. "Then you know my name, but you still stopped. You were going to be late. You stopped anyway." "Yes, ma'am." "Why?" Sarah looked at her. "Because you were dying." Victoria Hall pressed her lips together. Her eyes went bright, and she blinked once hard, the controlled blink of a woman who has spent decades in rooms full of powerful men and learned to manage emotion the way you manage a budget, carefully without waste. But the blink didn't fully do the job, and she looked briefly away down the hall toward the water-stained ceiling, and when she looked back, she said, "May we come in?" Sarah stepped back from the door. They came in. Her apartment had never felt smaller. Morrison squeezed her arm as he passed her, a brief, solid grip that said more than he would have put into words, and she nodded at him without speaking because there was too much in the moment, and neither of them were people who handled too much by talking about it. The 2 officers positioned themselves near the door, not in the room so much as present in it, the way security-conscious people occupy a space aware of exits, aware of angles present, without imposing. The man in the gray suit set his briefcase on the kitchen table without being invited to, clicked it open, and began organizing documents with the quiet efficiency of someone for whom other people's living rooms were simply temporary offices. Victoria sat down on Sarah's couch. Sarah sat across from her in the chair she'd been sleeping in for 2 nights because she couldn't make herself lie flat in her bed with the thoughts she was carrying. "I want to tell you something," Victoria said, "and I need you to let me finish before you respond, because I've been rehearsing this in my head since the moment I was well enough to rehearse anything, and if you interrupt me, I'm going to lose it, and I'd prefer not to do that in front of the Colonel." From near the door, the Marine Colonel Hayes Sarah would learn his name later, cleared his throat with what was almost certainly the suppression of a smile. "Okay," Sarah said. "I was dead," Victoria said. "That's not dramatic language." My heart stopped. On a sidewalk in Detroit on a Tuesday morning, my heart stopped, and the only reason I am sitting in your living room right now is because you were late for work. She paused. "My husband has been telling me for 20 years that I push myself too hard, that I don't sleep enough, that I need to slow down. I've been telling him for 20 years that he worries too much." She looked at her hands. He was right. I almost ran out of time to tell him that. Sarah didn't say anything. "I've been told," Victoria continued, "that the hospital fired you, that they called it protocol, that they used the language of compliance and documentation to do something that has no defensible justification." She looked up. "I want you to know that my husband and I are not people who accept that kind of thing quietly." "Mrs. Hall, I'm not finished." Victoria's voice was gentle, but there was iron under it, the iron of a woman who has navigated boardrooms and charity galas, and the specific brutality of being underestimated for 6 decades. "My husband's name is on the cardiac wing of that hospital. We have given Riverside Memorial $4.2 million over the last 11 years. We gave that money because we believed the hospital's mission was patient care, not liability management, not budget optimization. Patient care." Each of the last 2 words landed with separate weight. If it turns out that the hospital has confused those things, then we have a significant problem with where our money has gone. The silence that followed was the kind that has mass to it. "What are you planning to do?" Sarah asked. Victoria looked at the man in the gray suit. "Robert?" Robert closed his briefcase with a soft click. Ms. Bennett, he said, his voice the kind of smooth that comes from years of very expensive legal education. My name is Robert Callahan. I represent the Hall family's interests, both personal and philanthropic. What Mrs. Hall is planning to do is withdraw their pending donation of $1.8 million from the hospital's upcoming endowment campaign, demand a full accounting of the hospital's employment practices over the last 5 years, or retain separate counsel to pursue a wrongful termination action on your behalf at no cost to you, and schedule a meeting with the hospital's board of directors for next Tuesday morning, at which point Mrs. Hall intends to ask some very direct questions in front of some very uncomfortable people. Sarah stared at him. She stopped. You don't have to do all of that. We know we don't have to, Victoria said simply. That's rather the point. Morrison had been quiet through all of this. Now he pulled a chair from the kitchen table and turned it around and sat with his arms folded across the back of it, watching Sarah with the kind of attention that meant he was reading her something he had been doing since they were deployed together, and he'd needed to know in real time whether the people around him were holding together or starting to fracture. How are you actually doing? He asked. The question cut straight through the formal atmosphere in the room and landed somewhere personal. I'm fine, Sarah said automatically. Sarah, she looked at him. At his face, older than the photograph on her wall, the lines deeper, the gray coming in at the temples, but the eyes exactly the same, the eyes of a man who had decided a long time ago that honesty was more useful than comfort. I don't know, she said, which was the true answer. Have you eaten today? She had to think about it. Coffee. Morrison turned to the colonel. Hayes, tell me you brought something. Colonel Hayes, without expression, reached into the inside pocket of his uniform jacket and produced a granola bar. Sarah almost laughed. It came out as a sound that was somewhere between a laugh and something she didn't have a name for, and she pressed the back of her hand to her mouth for a moment and looked at the ceiling. Victoria watched her with an expression that was not pity. It was something more clear-eyed than pity. It was recognition, the look of someone who has been in rooms where everything falls apart and has learned to respect people who don't collapse under the weight of them. You're allowed to be angry, Victoria said quietly. I know. Are you? Sarah put her hand down. She looked at Victoria directly. Yes, she said. I'm very angry. I have been a nurse for 12 years. I have worked in that hospital for 9. I have missed meals and skipped days off and stayed late and come in early, and I have never not once compromised a patient's care. And they fired me for doing the thing that I went into this profession to do. Her voice was steady and her eyes were clear, and the anger in it was not hot, but cold, the kind of cold that burns worse. So yes, I'm angry. Victoria nodded slowly. Good, she said. Hold on to that. It was the same thing Morrison had told her 2 nights ago. Hold on to that. Robert Callahan produced documents. He laid them on the kitchen table, 3 of them side by side with the careful deliberateness of a man who understands that paper is where things become real. The first document, he said, is a letter on behalf of Mrs. Hall formally requesting that the hospital's board initiate a review of your termination. This is being hand-delivered to the board chair this afternoon. He moved to the next paper. The second is a formal notice of suspension of the Hall family's pending philanthropic commitment pending the outcome of that review. The hospital's development office will receive this at the same time. He gestured to the third document. This last one is for you. Sarah looked at it. It was a 1-page letter, clean and direct. Representation agreement, pro bono legal services. No signature required immediately. I want to be very clear, Callahan said, that this is not charity. This is representation that any competent employment attorney would want to take. What Riverside Memorial did is, in my professional opinion, legally indefensible. The exposure they have created for themselves is, he paused, choosing his word with care, considerable. How considerable? Sarah asked. Wrongful termination? Potential whistleblower retaliation if we can establish that your other disciplinary incidents were retaliatory in nature. Possible OSHA implications if we can demonstrate a pattern of discouraging emergency intervention. He tapped the document straight. Ms. Bennett, the short answer is they should not have done this. Sarah looked at the documents for a long moment. Then she looked at Morrison. Morrison looked back at her with an expression that said, your call, it's always your call. He had never been the kind of man who made decisions for people he respected. She picked up the pen that Callahan had set beside the document, and she signed her name. Victoria Hall stood up to leave 20 minutes later, and something shifted in the room when she did, the energy of the meeting changing, settling into something that felt less like crisis management and more like a line being drawn. At the door, Victoria turned back. "I want to ask you something," she said, "and you don't have to answer it." "Go ahead," Sarah said. "When you stopped on that sidewalk and you were already late, you knew you were already in trouble. Was there a moment where you thought about not stopping? Even for a second?" Sarah thought about it honestly, the way Victoria's directness demanded honesty. "No," she said. Victoria nodded as though this confirmed something she had already known. "That's what I told Edward," she said. "He asked me the same thing. He wanted to understand who you were. What kind of person? I told him she didn't stop because she calculated the risk and decided it was worth it. She stopped because stopping was the only thing she knew how to do. Because that's who she is." She paused. "I was right, wasn't I?" Sarah didn't answer, but Victoria didn't need her to. She walked out. The officers followed. Robert Callahan clicked his briefcase and followed them. Morrison stayed. He waited until the sound of footsteps had faded completely. Then he looked at Sarah with the look that meant the professional distance was down and they were just two people who had been through things together. "You okay?" he said, different inflection than before. "Personal." "Who called you?" Sarah asked. "Really?" Morrison was quiet for a beat. Then Hayes knew Victoria Hall's husband. They'd worked together on a Veterans Foundation board 3 years ago. When the EMS report flagged your name and it got back to someone who knew someone, he shrugged. "You know how it works. Information moves. You came all the way to Detroit." "Bennett." He said her name the way he'd said it in the field when she needed to pay attention. "You kept one of our own alive out there once. You remember Kowalski? Camp Leatherneck, 110 degrees IED shrapnel in places shrapnel has no business being. You sat with him for 4 hours. You didn't stop." She remembered. She had tried not to think about that night for a long time because the fear she'd felt during those 4 hours, the very specific fear of losing someone while doing everything right, was the kind of fear that doesn't fully leave you. "You came all the way to Detroit," she said again, softer this time. "You would have done the same," he said, simply, without drama. And she would have. That was the thing. That had always been the thing about the people she'd served with. There was no calculation to it. You showed up. You stayed. You didn't leave people behind. She had carried that into nursing. She understood now exactly why the hospital had found her difficult. Because she didn't know how to leave people behind, and that made her terrible at following certain kinds of rules. "What happens now?" she asked. "Now?" Morrison said, "We wait for Tuesday." "What happens Tuesday?" He picked up his jacket from the back of the kitchen chair where he'd draped it. "Victoria Hall walks into a board meeting at Riverside Memorial," he said. "And Edward Hall's name is on the door of the cardiac wing, and Linda Dawson has no idea what's about to happen to her." Sarah processed this. "And if they settle, if they just offer me money to go away quietly?" Morrison looked at her for a long moment. He had known her for 16 years. He knew exactly what she was going to say next, and he watched her figure out that she was going to say it, and he let her get there on her own. "I won't take it," she said. He nodded. "No," he said, "you won't." He walked toward the door, hand on the knob. Then he stopped and half turned, and there was something in his face that was older than humor and quieter than sentiment. The face of someone who has stood beside people in the worst moments and watched them come through, and who carries the memory of that with them and always. "For what it's worth," he said. "Patricia Hollins called the EMS station this morning. Anonymously, she gave a statement confirming the timeline of your intervention and the clinical accuracy of your handoff report." A pause. "She's not entirely what they built her to be." The door closed behind him. Sarah stood alone in her apartment. On the table, a signed document. 3 days ago, she had been a nurse with a mom and a clean record, and no idea that a woman named Victoria Hall existed. Today, she had a decorated Army captain, a Marine colonel, a high-powered attorney, and the single largest private donor in Riverside Memorial's history standing in her corner. And somewhere across the city, in an office on the 4th floor of that hospital, Director Linda Dawson was going through an ordinary Tuesday signing papers, running meetings, managing the institution she had built into whatever she had built it into. She didn't know yet that Tuesday was already coming for her. She didn't know that Sarah Bennett, who she had dismissed as a liability and erased from the payroll with a phone call, had just become something considerably more complicated. Sarah sat down at the kitchen table. She pulled the signed document toward her and looked at her own signature on it. Her hand had been steady when she signed it. She noticed that now. After everything, the sidewalk, the office, the suspension, the termination, the 2 days on the kitchen floor, her hand had been completely steady. That told her something. She folded the document carefully, stood up, put it in the drawer where she kept things that mattered. Then she went to make herself something to eat because Morrison was right and she was going to need her strength. Tuesday was 4 days away, and Sarah Bennett had never once in her life failed to show up. Orchestrated emotionally charged narrative continuation with strategic pacing and dramatic tension. Orchestrated emotionally charged narrative continuation with strategic pacing and dramatic tension. The 4 days between Morrison's visit and Tuesday morning were the longest of Sarah's life since the desert. She didn't sleep well. She ate enough to function. She ran every morning in the cold because movement was the only thing that kept the anxiety from settling into something permanent in her chest. And she waited, which was the hardest part because Sarah Bennett was not built for waiting. She was built for action, for intervention, for the forward motion of doing. Sitting still while other people moved pieces around a board on her behalf went against something fundamental in her. Morrison checked in every day. Brief calls, just long enough to confirm that she was still holding together and that the pieces were still moving. Robert Callahan called on Sunday evening to run her through what the board meeting would look like, what to expect, what not to expect, and to tell her that the hospital had already made one quiet attempt to reach Victoria Hall, directly not through official channels, but through a mutual acquaintance, to suggest that perhaps the situation could be resolved without formal proceedings. Victoria had not responded to the attempt. "What does that mean?" Sarah asked. "It means they're already scared," Callahan said. And she could hear just barely a professional satisfaction in it that attorneys are not supposed to let show. "Scared people make mistakes, Ms. Bennett. We're going to let them make theirs." She hung up and stared at the ceiling for a while. On Monday morning, her phone rang with a number she didn't recognize, a Detroit number, but not one she had in her contacts. She answered it. "Is this Sarah Bennett?" The voice was female, young, and carried the particular tightness of someone saying something they are afraid to say. "Who is this?" Sarah asked. A pause. "My name is Angela Reyes. I worked in patient records at Riverside Memorial. I was let go 8 months ago." Another pause longer. "I saw the story about what happened to you." "What story?" "Someone posted on the hospital's community board. Anonymous. Just the facts that you were fired after stopping to help a cardiac patient on the street. No names, no editorializing. Just the facts." Angela's voice was steadier now, like she'd decided to commit to the call. "There are a lot of comments, Ms. Bennett, from former staff, people who were let go, people who are still there and afraid to use their names." Sarah sat up straighter. "How many people?" "The post has been up since yesterday morning. 47 comments as of an hour ago." A breath. "I know that might not sound like a lot, but most of those people never talk. The culture at that hospital, you know what it's like. You say the wrong thing, you challenge the wrong person, and you're out. A lot of people just go quietly because they can't afford not to." Sarah was quiet for a moment. "Why are you calling me?" "Because I was one of the people who went quietly," Angela said. "And I have been angry about it for 8 months, and I didn't know what to do with that until I read about what happened to you." She stopped. "Then, I want to talk to your lawyer." Angela Reyes was the first. By Monday afternoon, she was not the last. Callahan's office received 4 additional calls from former Riverside Memorial employees before the end of the business day. A respiratory therapist who had been terminated 2 years ago after filing an internal complaint about staffing ratios. A charge nurse from the pediatric floor who had been eased out in what the hospital called a restructuring 6 months after she'd formally objected to a cost-cutting measure that eliminated an overnight monitoring position. 2 orderlies separately who had both been let go within weeks of each other after they had reported a medication management issue to a supervisor rather than handling it quietly. Callahan called Sarah that evening. "We have a pattern," he said, and the professional satisfaction that had been merely audible on Sunday was considerably more pronounced now. A documented, demonstrable pattern of terminating employees who raise concerns through internal channels. This is no longer a wrongful termination case, Ms. Bennett. This is potentially a systemic retaliation case. And if the federal angle holds, and I believe it will, we're looking at OSHA whistleblower protections, potentially CMS involvement, given that this is a Medicare and Medicaid participating hospital, and he stopped himself, recalibrated. The short version is this got considerably bigger today. Bigger how? Sarah asked. Bigger in the way that makes hospital boards lose sleep, he said. I'll see you Tuesday morning, 8 o'clock. Don't be late. He said it without thinking, and then the silence on the line told her he'd realized what he'd said, and she almost felt sorry for him. Mr. Callahan, she said, I'm never late when it matters. Tuesday arrived the way consequential days always do, without fanfare, with the same gray Detroit sky that had been there all week, indifferent to the fact that something was about to happen under it. Sarah was dressed and ready at 7. She had laid the clothes out the night before, not nursing scrubs, not the sweatshirt she'd been living in for the past week, but a dark blazer she'd bought 3 years ago for a hospital awards dinner and had worn exactly once. It fit the same. She was the same person she had been 3 years ago. That was the thing she needed to remember. Walking into that room, she was the same person. They had taken her badge. They had not taken what the badge represented. Morrison picked her up at 7:30. He was in civilian clothes, dark jacket, no uniform, but he carried himself in a way that made the uniform unnecessary. Hayes was already at the hospital. Callahan would meet them in the lobby. They didn't talk much in the car. Morrison drove, and Sarah watched Detroit move past the windows and thought about the woman on the sidewalk, about the 11 minutes, about the particular quality of silence on a street when something terrible is happening and everyone around it feels helpless. She had not felt helpless. That was the thing she kept coming back to. In the moment on her knees on that frozen concrete, she had not felt helpless. She had felt precise, purposeful. The training and the instinct and the years of experience all arriving at exactly the same point, focused entirely on keeping one human heart beating. And they had fired her for it. The anger came back clean and cold, and she let it. She was going to need it. The lobby of Riverside Memorial was familiar in the way that a place you've spent 9 years of your life is familiar. Not comfortable exactly, but inhabited, layered with memory. The portrait of Victoria Hall on the donor wall. The cardiac wing sign with Edward Hall's name. The nurse's station where she had started and ended thousands of shifts. The receptionist looked up when Sarah walked in and then looked away quickly in a manner that said she recognized Tra and had been told something about the situation and was not sure what the correct professional response was. Callahan was waiting near the elevator, briefcase in hand. He shook Sarah's hand, then Morrison's, and his expression was focused and brisk. The board is assembled, he said quietly. Victoria and Edward Hall arrived 20 minutes ago. They've been meeting privately with the board chair, which was not the plan, which means someone on the board tried to get ahead of this. He glanced at Morrison. That's a tell. How so? Morrison asked. They're trying to contain it before it becomes official, which means they know what's in their own records, and they'd rather this not become a formal proceeding. He straightened. We're going to make it a formal proceeding. They took the elevator to the 4th floor. The boardroom had a long table, 12 chairs. Large windows, a room designed to project institutional gravity. 8 board members were seated when Sarah walked in. Linda Dawson was at the far end in the chair that said she considered herself the authority in this room. She was a composed woman in her 50s, silver-haired and precise, the kind of administrator who had risen through hospital systems by being better than everyone else at making difficult decisions sound reasonable. She looked at Sarah when Sarah walked in. The look lasted exactly 1 second, controlled assessing. Then she shifted her gaze to Callahan, which told Sarah everything. Linda Dawson was not afraid of Sarah Bennett. She was afraid of what Sarah Bennett had brought into the room with her. Good, Sarah thought. She should be. Victoria and Edward Hall were seated to the left of the board chair. Edward was a large man, broad-shouldered, the kind of physical presence that takes up space naturally, and his face when Sarah entered the room was the face of a man who has decided something and has no intention of undeciding it. He stood when Sarah walked in, stood fully the way men of his generation stand when they are showing respect, and extended his hand. "Miss Bennett," he said, "Then. "Mr. Hall," she said. His handshake was firm and brief, and said, "I know what you did. I don't forget what people do." Victoria touched her arm lightly as Sarah passed and said nothing, but the touch carried the entire conversation they had had in Sarah's living room, compressed into a single point of contact. Sarah sat down. The board chair, a man named Gerald Fitch, who had the look of someone who had spent his career being comfortable, cleared his throat. "I want to begin by saying that this meeting was called under somewhat unusual circumstances. The circumstances," Callahan said pleasantly, "are that my client was wrongfully terminated after performing an emergency medical intervention that saved a life. I'd characterize them as fairly straightforward." Gerald Fitch blinked. "Mr. Callahan, this is a board meeting, not a hearing." "It will be a hearing," Callahan said still pleasantly, "either here with the opportunity to resolve this cooperatively or in a federal district court without that opportunity. I'm flexible about which venue we use." Linda Dawson's expression didn't change, but her hands, which had been flat on the table, moved just slightly, just enough, and she laced her fingers together, and that was the tell. Sarah saw it. She said nothing. The first 40 minutes of the meeting were procedural, Callahan presenting the timeline of Sarah's termination, the documentation, the witness statement from the EMS crew, the anonymous supervisor's call, corroborating Sarah's account. He was methodical and precise, and he moved through the information the way someone moves through a building they know well, confident, unhurried, aware of every room. The board listened. Some of them took notes. Two of them exchanged a look at the mention of the EMS corroboration that Sarah caught and filed away. And then Callahan set down his papers and said, "I'd now like to discuss Angela Reyes." Something changed in the room. It was subtle, a shift in the quality of the air, a very slight recalibration of several bodies and chairs. But Sarah had spent enough time in high-stakes situations to recognize the moment when people understand that the ground they thought they were standing on has changed shape. "Angela Reyes, were a symptom," Callahan continued, "was a patient records specialist terminated by this hospital 8 months ago. She contacted my office yesterday. She was followed within the same day by 4 other former employees, a respiratory therapist, a charge nurse, and 2 orderlies, all of whom have a story that follows a remarkably consistent pattern. Internal concern raised through proper channels, documentation, and then termination, restructuring, or forced resignation, typically within 90 to 120 days of the initial concern." Gerald Fitch opened his mouth. "I have their signed statements," Callahan said, opening his briefcase, "and I am prepared to file them as exhibits in a federal complaint if that would be more convenient for the board." The silence was total. Then Edward Hall spoke for the first time. His voice was even and deep and carried the particular weight of someone who is not performing authority, who simply has it. "Gerald," he said, looking at the board chair, "I've sat on the board of 3 hospital systems and 2 university medical centers. I've seen administrators make decisions I disagreed with. I've never pulled funding over a disagreement." He paused. "What I'm hearing today is not a disagreement. What I'm hearing is that this institution has been systematically removing people who tried to do the right thing. And my wife is alive right now because one of those people didn't let that system turn her into someone who walks past a dying woman on the street." He let that sit. "So I want to know, and I want an honest answer, not a managed answer, who knew?" The question hung over the table like something physical. Gerald Fitch looked at Linda Dawson, and Linda Dawson looked at Gerald Fitch. And in that exchange, in that 2-second look between 2 people who had navigated this institution together for years, Sarah saw the entire architecture of what had been done, and she understood that it had not been accidental, and she understood that it was worse than she had thought. What happened next was the moment that Sarah would later describe when people asked her about it as the moment the room cracked open. A board member named Dr. Caroline Webb, a physician, one of 2 on the board, a woman Sarah had seen in the hospital's hallways and never spoken to, looked up from her notepad and said quietly and distinctly, "I raised concerns about the termination pattern 18 months ago." The room went absolutely still. "I brought it to the quality committee." Dr. Webb continued, her voice steady in the way that voices are steady when someone has been waiting a long time to say something. "I documented my concerns formally. I was told that the HR practices were within compliance guidelines and that the matter had been reviewed." She looked at Linda Dawson. It had not been reviewed, had it, Linda? It was not a question. Linda Dawson said nothing. Had it? Dr. Webb said again. The silence from the end of the table was its own answer. And it was the silence, not a denial, not a deflection, not even a managed non-response that did it. That was the moment the containment failed. Sarah could see it happen in real time. The board members who had been maintaining professional neutrality, shifting, recalculating, deciding which side of this they wanted to be on when it finished. Gerald Fitch looked like a man who had just understood that the meeting he'd organized to resolve a problem had instead become the problem. Morrison, who had been standing quietly near the door, arms folded, face unreadable, caught Sarah's eye. He gave her one small, deliberate nod. She looked away before anyone else noticed the exchange. Callahan was already speaking again, but Sarah's mind was 3 steps ahead of the room. She was thinking about Angela Reyes, who had called her Monday morning with a voice full of 8 months of quiet anger. She was thinking about the respiratory therapist, the charge nurse, the 2 orderlies, people who had done what they were supposed to do, raised their hands, followed the channels, and been erased for it. She was thinking about Patricia Hollins, who had called the EMS station anonymously and confirmed the timeline. About the conflict she'd heard underneath Patricia's controlled voice in that small office, the voice of someone who was also caught between the system she served and the person she might actually be. The hospital had built a culture of silence by making the cost of speaking too high. And it had worked until one Tuesday morning in February on a frozen sidewalk when a woman collapsed and a nurse who didn't know how to stop being a nurse got on her knees and refused to let the culture win. Sarah heard Callahan say her name and came back to the room. "Ms. Bennett," he said, and his voice carried a particular deliberateness. "Would you like to address the board directly?" Every face at the table turned toward her. She had not prepared a speech. She had thought about it, had lain awake Sunday night, turning phrases over, trying to find the right way to say what needed to be said. But every version had felt constructed, and Sarah Bennett did not do constructed. So she said what was true. "I have been a nurse for 12 years, she said. "I have been in this hospital for 9. I have missed meals and skipped vacations and come in on my days off and held hands and made calls and sat with families in the worst moments of their lives. I did all of that because I believed, genuinely believed, that this institution was built around the same thing I am built around, which is the idea that the patient comes first. Every time. Without exception." She looked at Linda Dawson as she said the next part. "I found out I was wrong about that on the morning I stopped to save a woman's life and came to work and was told that my inability to walk past a dying person on the sidewalk made me a liability." She paused. "I don't want your money. I don't want a settlement. I want this board to look at what has been built in this hospital and acknowledge what it is, and then I want them to take it apart." The room was completely silent. Edward Hall looked at the board with the expression of a man delivering a final instruction. "I think," he said quietly, "that's a reasonable request." Linda Dawson's hands, still laced together on the table, had gone white at the knuckles. Sarah watched her and felt something that wasn't quite satisfaction and wasn't quite relief and wasn't quite grief, but contained parts of all 3. The feeling of someone who has been inside a broken system for long enough to understand exactly how it broke, and who has finally said the true thing out loud in the right room. The board chair called a recess at 11:47 a.m. When they reconvened at 12:30, Linda Dawson was not in her seat. No one on the board explained her absence. They didn't need to. Linda Dawson's empty chair sat at the end of the table like a confession. No one on the board acknowledged it directly. Gerald Fitch called the session back to order at 12:32 with the carefully composed expression of a man who has spent a career managing optics, and he opened by saying that the board needed time to conduct an internal review and that all parties should expect a formal response within 10 business days. Callahan had his pen cap off before Fitch finished the sentence. 10 business days, Callahan said pleasantly, is not going to work for us. Fitch blinked. "Mr. Callahan, the board has a process. The board had a process 18 months ago when Dr. Webb raised concerns about the termination pattern, and those concerns were buried." Callahan's voice stayed pleasant. It was more effective that way. The pleasantness made it clear he didn't need to raise his voice to win. "My client's financial obligations don't pause for internal reviews. Her rent is due. Her mother's insurance is due. The employment damage begins accumulating from the day of wrongful termination, not from the day the board decides it's ready to talk about it. He set his pen down. We'll give you 72 hours. If we don't have a substantive response in 72 hours, we file. And once we file, the 10 business days become someone else's problem. And the board member to Fitch's left, a man named Warren Cho, who had said nothing the entire meeting, but whose expression had been shifting steadily away from neutral for the past hour, leaned forward. What exactly does filing look like at this stage? Federal court complaint. OSHA whistleblower retaliation claim. Request for emergency injunctive relief to preserve all HR and personnel records from the past 7 years. Callahan paused. And a press release because we're going to need the public to understand what's happening. And my experience is that the public tends to be very interested in stories about hospitals that fire nurses for saving lives. The press release landed differently than everything else had. Sarah watched it move through the room, watched 3 board members glance at each other, watched Warren Cho sit back, slowly watched Gerald Fitch's jaw tighten in a way that had nothing to do with institutional process and everything to do with a man who had just understood what the next month of his life was going to look like. Edward Hall, who had been sitting with his arms folded and his face still since the session reconvened, added one sentence. My family's foundation has a communications team, he said. We won't be the ones issuing a press release, but we also won't be stopping anyone who does. Fitch looked at him, then at Victoria, then at Sarah. Sarah looked back at him steadily and said nothing because the room was already won, and she knew it, and the people who understand a room don't waste words when silence is doing the work. 72 hours, Fitch said finally. Starting now, Callahan said. They were in the elevator when Morrison's phone rang. He looked at the screen, then at Sarah, and there was something in the look that made her stomach tighten. Take it, she said. He stepped into the corner of the elevator, turned slightly, and answered in a low voice. She watched his face. Morrison had a face that gave very little away in professional situations. Years of operational command had trained him to manage expression the way other people manage breathing, automatic and controlled. But she knew his face the way you know the face of someone you've been afraid with, and she could read the micro-expressions that the training didn't fully reach. He was surprised, and then he wasn't surprised, and that transition from surprise to a settled, deliberate understanding was the version of his face that she associated with information that was significant. He hung up. The elevator doors opened. They walked out into the lobby before he said anything. That was a contact at the Detroit Free Press, he said quietly. A reporter named Diane Marsh. She's been working a story on Riverside Memorial for 3 months. Independent of everything, independent of you. Independent of the halls. She's been looking at the hospital's financial practices, specifically the relationship between cost-cutting initiatives and the timeline of employee terminations. Sarah stopped walking. She's already been investigating. For 3 months, Morrison said. She was going to publish with what she had in about 2 weeks. Then the community board post went up yesterday, the anonymous one, about your firing, and it confirmed 3 separate things she'd been trying to corroborate. He looked at her. She wants to talk to you. When at today if possible, she said, and I'm quoting her directly, the story just got a spine. Sarah thought about this for approximately 4 seconds. Call her back, she said. Diane Marsh was 41 years old, compact and quick with the kind of focused energy that comes from years of running toward things other people run away from. She met them at a coffee shop 2 blocks from the hospital, and she had a recorder on the table before she'd finished sitting down. Ground rules, she said, looking at Sarah directly. Everything on record unless you tell me otherwise. I don't do anonymous sources as primary material. I'll use background and corroboration. But the spine of the story needs named people willing to stand behind what they say. Are you a named source? Yes, Sarah said. Diane looked at her for a beat, assessing. Most people take a few minutes to think about that. I've had 4 days, Sarah said. I'm done thinking. Something shifted in Diane's expression, not surprise exactly, but a kind of professional recognition, the look of a reporter who has found the person who is going to make the story real. Tell me about the sidewalk, Diane said. So Sarah told her. She told it straight the way she told everything, no embellishment, no editorializing the facts laid out in sequence with the clinical precision of a nurse documenting a patient interaction. 12 minutes late, the sound, the woman down, the pulse, 11 minutes. The paramedic's face, walking into the hospital with wet knees and a racing heart and knowing before she opened the door that it was going to be bad. Diane listened without interrupting. She was a good listener, the kind who made you feel like the words mattered, because to her, they did not in a performed way, but in the actual way of someone who understands that a story is built out of true details and that the true details are sacred. When Sarah finished, Diane said, "Patricia Hollins, is she a source?" "Not for me to say," Sarah said. "Okay." Diane made a note. "The 5 employees who contacted Callahan's office, do any of them want to be named?" "You'd have to ask Callahan." "Already have a call in." Diane looked up from her notepad. "Ms. Bennett, I want to ask you something off the record for a moment. You can tell me to put it back on." Sarah nodded. "Are you prepared for what happens when this publishes? Because what I have and what you've now given me is a story that is going to be uncomfortable for a lot of people. Not just Dawson, not just the hospital. This goes up the chain. There are board members who should have known things they say they didn't know. There are regulatory bodies that should have been notified and weren't. Once this is out, it doesn't go back in." She paused. "People are going to say things about you. They'll question your record. They'll question your motivations. That's how this works. I want you to know that before we go further." Sarah looked at her steadily. 12 years ago, Sarah said, "I was in a field hospital in a country I won't name on record, and a commanding officer told me that if I reported a certain set of conditions I'd witnessed, my career would be the first casualty. I filed the report anyway." She paused. "I'm not new to this." Diane held her gaze for a moment. Then she nodded, put the recorder back in the center of the table, and then said, "Back on record. Tell me about the Army." The story ran 4 days later. Not online, not buried in the Metro section front page of the Detroit Free Press above the fold, with a photograph of the hospital's main entrance and a headline that Sarah read 3 times standing at her kitchen counter with coffee going cold in her hand. "Fired for saving a life, how Riverside Memorial built a culture of silence and what it cost." Diane had done what she promised. The story had a spine. Sarah's name was at the center of it, but the architecture was built from 5 years of documented terminations, financial records that showed a direct correlation between cost reduction initiatives under Linda Dawson's administration and the acceleration of employee separations in 3 named sources. Angela Reyes, the respiratory therapist, whose name was Marcus Webb, and Dr. Caroline Webb, who had given in an on-record interview that took 45 minutes, and was, Diane told Sarah when she called at 6 a.m. the morning of publication, the most important 45 minutes of the entire investigation. Sarah's phone began ringing at 6:15 and did not meaningfully stop for the next 8 hours. Her friend Donna called first. She was crying before she finished saying Sarah's name. "I told you that place was rotten," Donna said. "I told you." "You told me," Sarah said. "You were right. Are you okay?" Sarah stopped. Thought about it honestly. "I don't know yet. Ask me in a week." Morrison called from wherever he was. She could hear traffic. Figured he was back in transit to wherever his life actually was when he wasn't showing up in her parking lot with a military helicopter. "You've seen it," he said. It wasn't a question. "I've seen it. A P-wire picked it up 20 minutes ago," he said. "It's going national." She sat down on the kitchen floor again, the same spot where she'd sat when his first call came in 4 days and a lifetime ago. She put her back against the cabinet and held the phone and didn't say anything for a moment. "Morrison," she said. "Yeah. Did you know when you called me that first night? Did you already know about Diane Marsh's investigation?" A pause. Honest pause, the pause of a man deciding how much truth to give and landing on all of it. "Hayes knew," Morrison said. "He'd been approached as a background source 3 weeks earlier. He didn't know you were connected to it yet. When your name came up through the EMS report," he stopped. "It wasn't a coincidence that we moved fast, Sarah. I want you to know that. But it also wasn't orchestrated. You earned every piece of this." She thought about that. "Okay," she said. "Okay. Okay." She stood up off the kitchen floor. "I'm done sitting on this floor. What do I do today?" "Callahan called me 10 minutes ago. The hospital's legal team reached out this morning. They want to meet. Not in 72 hours this morning." Of course they did. The story was national. The AP wire had it. By noon, it would be on cable news, and by evening, it would be the kind of story that gets a segment on network news with B-roll of the hospital exterior and a chyron that some producer would spend 20 minutes wordsmithing. The hospital's window for quiet resolution had just closed. "Tell Callahan I'll be there," Sarah said. The meeting was not in the boardroom. It was in a smaller conference room on the second floor, and the people in it were different. No board members, no Gerald Fitch, no empty chair where Linda Dawson used to sit. Instead, there were two attorneys from a firm. Sarah didn't recognize a woman introduced as the hospital's interim director of operations, a title that had not existed yesterday, which meant they'd created it this morning, and a man from the hospital's insurance carrier whose presence made the nature of the meeting immediately clear. They had a number. Callahan looked at it, looked at Sarah, looked back at the attorneys. "My client's position," he said, "has not changed since Tuesday. Ms. Bennett is not interested in personal settlement. She is interested in institutional accountability." The lead attorney, a man named Harris, expensive suit, the look of someone who resolves situations before they become precedents, leaned forward. "Mr. Callahan, I want to be direct with you. The hospital is prepared to make significant concessions, reinstatement with full back pay, a formal public apology, revision of the HR practices that have been identified in this investigation, an independent review of the 5 additional termination cases. We can—" "Linda Dawson," Sarah said. Everyone looked at her. She had not been planning to speak, but she had been sitting at this table for 11 minutes listening to a settlement being constructed around her like a room she hadn't agreed to be in, and the things she needed said had not been said. "What happens to Linda Dawson?" she said. Harris glanced at his colleague. "Brief, careful. Director Dawson has tendered her resignation effective." "Has she been reported to the state health department?" Sarah asked. "Has the board formally notified CMS? Has anyone contacted the Michigan Department of Health and Human Services about the pattern of retaliatory terminations and what they may have meant for patient safety?" She let each question land separately, because resignation isn't accountability. Resignation is someone leaving a room before the consequences arrive. The insurance man shifted in his chair. Harris said carefully, "Those are matters that will be addressed through the appropriate—" "They are matters," Callahan said, placing both hands flat on the table, "that will be addressed through a federal investigation if they are not addressed by this institution proactively and on the record." He looked at Harris. "My client has been in contact with the Office of the U.S. Attorney for the Eastern District of Michigan. We have not filed anything. We are making that decision today in this room based on what this institution is willing to put in writing." The room went very quiet. The interim director of operations, whose name was Lynn Park, and who had the look of someone who had been handed an enormous problem that was not of her making and had decided to treat it with the competence it required, spoke for the first time. "What do you need in writing?" she asked. Not adversarially, practically. The voice of someone who wanted to solve the actual problem. Sarah looked at her. There was something in Lynn Park's directness that reminded her of people she trusted in the field, people who understood that the fastest way through a crisis was straight through it, not around it. "A formal report to CMS filed within 48 hours disclosing the pattern of terminations in the board's prior knowledge," Sarah said. "An independent third-party review of all HR actions under Dawson's administration. The findings made public. And a patient safety review independent external of any clinical decisions that may have been affected by staffing changes resulting from the retaliatory terminations." Harris opened his mouth. "The patient safety review is non-negotiable," Sarah said. "People were fired for raising concerns. I want to know if any of those concerns were valid. And if they were valid, I want to know if patients were affected. Because that's what this is actually about. Not my job, not the settlement number, the patients." The silence that followed was the longest one yet. Lynn Park looked at Harris. Harris looked at the insurance man. The insurance man looked at the table, and then slowly, the way a man moves when he's calculating numbers in his head and arriving at an answer he doesn't like, but can't argue with. He nodded. They came out of the meeting at 2:17 in the afternoon. The agreement was not signed. That would take several days of drafting and review. But the framework was in place, and framework was enough for now. The patient safety review was in it. The CMS disclosure was in it. The independent HR audit was in it, and a provision added in the final 20 minutes at Lynn Park's initiative establishing a formal whistleblower protection policy and an external ombudsman for clinical staff concerns, something that would have prevented everything had it existed 5 years ago. They stood in the hospital corridor. Callahan was already on his phone. Morrison was reading something on his own screen. Sarah was standing still. A nurse she recognized, a woman named Claire, from the third-floor cardiac unit, who had worked beside Sarah for 4 years, came around the corner and stopped when she saw her. Claire was in scrubs mid-shift, and for a moment she just stood there looking at Sarah with an expression that had too many things in it to name. Then she crossed the corridor and hugged her. Hard without words, the way people hug in hospitals when words aren't sufficient to the moment. Sarah held on. Over Claire's shoulder, she could see the door to the cardiac wing. The nameplate, Edward Hall Cardiac Center. She thought about the 11 minutes on the sidewalk, about the pulse she'd found thin and skipping barely there, refusing to disappear. She thought about the 4 hours she'd sat with Kowalski in the field hospital while the temperature outside was 110 and she had refused to believe that doing everything right would not be enough. She had always known on some cellular level that the thing keeping her in this work was not the system. The system had always been imperfect, bureaucratic, political, shaped by money and liability, and the competing pressures of every institution that grows large enough to forget why it started. The thing keeping her in the work was the pulse. That first faint, miraculous, determined pulse under 2 fingers on a frozen Detroit sidewalk. The proof that life was stubborn and that it responded to someone who refused to let it go. She had saved a life. They had fired her for it. And then the life she saved had sent a helicopter. She pulled back from Claire's hug and looked at her. "How's the unit?" Sarah asked. Claire laughed, a wet, slightly broken laugh. "Short-staffed," she said. "We're always short-staffed." "I know," Sarah said. "Are you coming back?" Sarah looked down the corridor, at the nameplate, at the nurse's station at the far end, at the whole complicated, imperfect, necessary place. "That depends," she said, "on whether this hospital becomes somewhere worth coming back to." Claire looked at her for a moment. Then she nodded slowly, seriously, the nod of someone who understands that this is not a platitude, but a genuine condition and who believes it might actually be met. She went back to her shift. Morrison appeared at Sarah's shoulder. "National News called Callahan's office," he said. 3 networks. "They want interviews." Sarah had known this was coming, had been bracing for it since the AP wire. The story going national meant her face going national, meant her name going national, meant the particular exposure of being the human symbol of something larger than yourself, which was both necessary and terrifying in equal measure. "What does Callahan say?" she asked. "He says it's your call. All of it. Always has been." She thought about Angela Reyes calling on a Monday morning with 8 months of quiet anger and nowhere to put it. About Marcus Webb, the respiratory therapist. About the charge nurse. About the 2 orderlies who had done the right thing and been erased for it. Those people didn't have a helicopter. They didn't have a Victoria Hall. They didn't have a Morrison or a Hayes or a Robert Callahan with a briefcase and a pleasant voice that made hospital administrators lose sleep. They had her. "Set them up," she said. Morrison nodded. "One condition," she added. "Name it. Every interview I talk about them. Not just me. Every single one of them. Their names, their stories, what was done to them. If I'm going to be on camera, I'm bringing everyone with me." Morrison looked at her with the expression he reserved for moments when she did exactly the thing he had known she was going to do. "Wouldn't have expected anything else," he said. Her phone buzzed. Unknown number. New York area code. She answered it. "Ms. Bennett," said a voice she would later recognize as belonging to a producer at one of the 3 largest news networks in the country. "My name is Tom Wheeler. I'm calling because the country needs to hear your story." Sarah looked at the cardiac wing nameplate one more time. "Then let's make sure they hear all of it," she said. Tom Wheeler was not a man who wasted time on small stories. Sarah figured that out in the first 30 seconds of the call from the pace of his sentences, the specific questions he asked, the way he cut through pleasantries, the way a surgeon cuts through tissue efficiently and without apology. He had been producing national news segments for 22 years. He had covered 3 wars, 2 financial crises, and 1 pandemic. He did not call people from Detroit on a Wednesday afternoon, unless he believed what was happening mattered beyond Detroit. "I've read the Free Press piece," he said. "I've pulled your service record publicly available, just the broad strokes. And I've spoken with two of the former employees who are on record with your attorney." A pause. "Ms. Bennett, what's happening at Riverside Memorial is not an isolated incident. I want to give you national airtime to say that, and I want to do it this week while the story has momentum. Are you interested?" "On one condition," Sarah said. Same thing she told Morrison 60 seconds earlier. "Every interview we talk about, all of them, Angela Reyes, Marcus Webb, the charge nurse, the orderlies, every person that hospital erased. I'm not doing this as a personal story. I'm doing it as their story." Wheeler was quiet for exactly 2 seconds. "That," he said, "makes it a better segment. I'll have my producer call your attorney today." He hung up. Morrison was watching her with his arms folded. "You know what's coming now," he said. It wasn't a question. "I know," Sarah said. "It gets loud. It gets personal. People who've never met you are going to have opinions about you. Some of them won't be kind." "Morrison." She looked at him with the look she'd used in the field when he was being thorough about things she'd already thought through. "I spent 6 years in a combat zone. I think I can handle cable news." He uncrossed his arms. "Fair point." The segment aired Thursday evening. Sarah sat in her apartment with her phone face down on the coffee table because looking at it was not going to help. Morrison was there. Donna was there because Donna had shown up Wednesday night with food and refused to leave, which was exactly the kind of friendship that gets built in I See Us, in Trauma Bays, and holds for life. The anchor introduced the segment. Sarah watched herself on screen, sitting across from Tom Wheeler in a Chicago studio they'd flown her to that morning, and had the strange experience of seeing herself from the outside, the way she would look to someone who didn't know her. She looked calm. She looked certain. She looked like someone who was not performing any of those things, but simply inhabiting them, because there was nothing left to perform after the last 8 days had stripped everything unnecessary away. She talked about the sidewalk. She talked about the 11 minutes. She talked about the pulse, the thing she kept coming back to, the pulse that had been there, barely refusing to give up. Then she turned and she talked about Angela Reyes and Marcus Webb and the charge nurse whose name was Patricia Cole and who had driven her children to school every morning for 2 years after she was fired and then sat in the parking lot and cried because she couldn't afford the therapy she needed and didn't want them to see. She said Patricia Cole's name clearly, with weight, the way names deserve to be said when someone has been invisible long enough. She talked about what the hospital had built, not in language of malice, because she genuinely didn't think it had started as malice. She talked about it in the way she understood it as a system that had slowly, incrementally prioritized its own comfort over its stated mission, and had done so by removing the people who reminded it of what it was supposed to be, one termination at a time, one quiet departure at a time, until the only people left were the ones who had learned not to say the difficult thing out loud. Wheeler asked her about Victoria Hall. "I didn't know who she was," Sarah said. "I still don't think about her that way, honestly. I think about her the way I think about every patient as a person who needed help. The rest of it, who she is, what her name means, what happened after, none of that was in my mind on that sidewalk. There was a heartbeat that was failing. That's all there was." Wheeler looked at her for a moment before asking his next question. She recognized the look. She'd seen it on the faces of paramedics and ER physicians and combat surgeons, people who work adjacent to life or death situations and have learned to recognize when they are in the presence of someone for whom that proximity is not dramatic, but simply occupational. A look that said, "You mean that. You actually just mean that." "And the firing," he asked. "The firing," Sarah said, "was the hospital telling me that what I am is a problem. And I want every nurse, every medic, every person who has ever gone into healthcare because they believe that the patient comes first. I want them to hear that and understand that what this hospital did is not acceptable. Not as an isolated incident, not as a policy dispute. It is not acceptable for any institution that calls itself a place of healing to punish someone for healing." The segment ran 7 minutes. By the time the anchor moved to the next story, Sarah's name was trending on every major social media platform simultaneously. Donna was looking at her phone with an expression that moved rapidly from surprise to something that had no clean name. "Sarah," she said, "there are nurses posting from everywhere. I'm seeing Michigan, Ohio, Texas, California people talking about being fired, being pressured, being told to look the other way. She looked up. This is not just Riverside Memorial. Sarah had known this, had known it at some level since Angela Reyes called on Monday morning that the reason the community board post had generated 47 comments in 18 hours was not because Riverside Memorial was uniquely corrupt, but because it had done in concentrated form what 100 institutions had been doing in quieter ways for years. She had known it. Seeing it arrive in real time was different. Her phone buzzed. Callahan. She answered it. We've had 11 calls since the segment ended, he said. Without greeting, without preamble, Callahan in full operational mode. 3 from former employees of Riverside Memorial, 8 from nurses and medical staff at other institutions across 4 states, all reporting similar patterns, all wanting to know how to file complaints, who to contact, what protections exist. He paused. I also have a call pending from the office of Senator Davis, Healthcare Subcommittee. They want to discuss whether this warrants a federal inquiry. The air in Sarah's apartment changed when she said that out loud. Morrison looked at her sharply. Donna put her phone down. A federal inquiry, Sarah repeated. Healthcare worker retaliation is a federal issue the moment Medicare and Medicaid funding is involved, Callahan said, which it is at Riverside Memorial and likely at several of the other institutions being named tonight. He paused again and she could hear him choosing his next words carefully. Sarah, I want you to understand something. 48 hours ago, this was a wrongful termination case with a compelling story. Tonight, it is potentially the beginning of a federal legislative investigation into systemic retaliation against healthcare workers. That is, he stopped himself. Then simply, that's larger than either of us planned for. Is that a problem? She asked. Not for justice, he said. For your personal life, for the next 6 to 12 months, yes. It's going to be a great deal. She looked at Morrison. He was watching her with the expression he'd worn every time a mission expanded beyond its original parameters, in the field not alarmed because alarm was a luxury, but fully present, fully aware, already calculating what the expansion required. Set up the call with Senator Davis's office, she said. The federal inquiry was announced 11 days later. Senator Janet Davis, chair of the Senate Healthcare Subcommittee, stood at a podium in Washington and used the words systemic retaliation patient, safety implications and accountability 3 times each, and mentioned Sarah Bennett's name twice, and mentioned Riverside Memorial Hospital once, and mentioned the 17 other institutions that had been named in formal complaints filed with OSHA in the 10 days since the national broadcast 4 times with a tone that said the 17 was a floor, not a ceiling. Sarah watched it on her laptop at Donna's kitchen table because being in her own apartment had become difficult. There were news vans that had been stationed outside her building since Friday, which she had expected, and a man who had knocked on her door Thursday claiming to represent a production company interested in a documentary, which she had not expected and was not ready to think about. Donna set coffee down next to the laptop. How do you feel? Donna asked. Sarah thought about it seriously the way she thought about all serious questions. Like someone picked up a very large rock, she said, and now everyone has to look at what's under it. Donna sat down across from her. And you're the person who picked up the rock. I stopped on a sidewalk, Sarah said. Victoria Hall brought the helicopter. Morrison made calls. Diane Marsh spent 3 months building the story. Callahan filed the paperwork. Angela Reyes got angry enough to pick up the phone. She looked at her coffee. I'm the person who started it. I'm not the person who did it alone. Donna looked at her for a moment with the expression of someone who has known another person long enough to understand when they are being precise and when they are being deflective, and has decided the moment doesn't require a challenge. Angela Reyes called this morning, Donna said. Sarah looked up. She called here. She didn't have your number. She got mine through the hospital grapevine. Donna pulled out her phone and read from it. Tell Sarah that I got a job offer today. Detroit Receiving, patient records supervisor position. They called me. Donna set the phone down. She was crying when she said it. Sarah felt something move through her that was not quite a feeling she could name, the particular compound emotion of someone who has set something in motion and is only now beginning to understand what the motion is reaching. She thought about Patricia Cole sitting in a parking lot crying so her kids wouldn't see. She thought about Marcus Webb. She thought about the charge nurse from the pediatric floor whose name was Jennifer Hart and who had been working 2 jobs for 6 months because her savings had run out and she hadn't been able to find a hospital position because the reference she'd received from Riverside Memorial had been carefully, professionally, lethally neutral. She pulled out her phone and called Callahan. "Jennifer Hart," she said when he answered, "the pediatric charge nurse. What's her situation?" A brief pause while he checked something. "Still in the review process. The independent audit hasn't formally concluded." "I know. I want to know if there's anything we can do to accelerate her case. She's been out 6 months. She has 2 jobs." "I'll look at it today," he said. "No pushback, no process objection. Just, I'll look at it today." She hung up. Morrison knocked on Donna's front door at noon. He came in, accepted coffee without asking for it because Donna had known him for 2 years by proximity and knew he always needed coffee, and sat down and looked at Sarah with his eyes that read rooms. "Hayes called," he said. "He's been approached by 3 veterans organizations about your case, specifically your history as a combat medic, and the argument that the skills and ethos you brought to that sidewalk were directly the product of military training. There's an angle here about what we ask veterans to be and then what we allow them to be when they come home." Sarah stared at him. "That's bigger than Riverside Memorial." "Yes," Morrison said. I know. I'm not telling you because you need to know it's out there, not because I think you need to carry it." "How do you decide which things to carry?" she asked. Genuinely, not rhetorically. He considered it. "You carry the things that are yours to carry," he said. "The sidewalk was yours. The 11 minutes, the decision to stop when stopping cost you everything. That's yours. The rest of it, the federal inquiry, the other hospitals, the veterans angle that happened because of what you did, but it's not yours to hold. Other people are holding it. Let them." She understood what he was telling her, and she understood why he was telling her, and she also understood that he knew she wouldn't fully be able to do it because she was Sarah Bennett, and Sarah Bennett did not easily put things down. "You're going to carry all of it anyway," he said, with the slight smile of a man who knows someone completely. "I just want you to know you don't have to." The Riverside Memorial Board reconvened 3 weeks after the initial meeting. Linda Dawson had not been seen publicly since the boardroom. Her resignation had been followed by a statement from her attorney declining comment, which was the kind of statement that meant her attorneys were managing something actively and quietly. The state health department had opened its own inquiry. The independent audit firm had begun its review of 5 years of HR records. Lynn Park, the interim director of operations, had been confirmed as the permanent director, a decision that took the board 6 days and a unanimous vote, which in Sarah's understanding of how hospital boards operate was nearly unprecedented. Lynn Park had called Sarah personally to tell her, which was also unprecedented, and the call had been brief and direct, the way calls between people who respect each other tend to be. "I want you to know," Lynn said, "that the whistleblower ombudsman position has been posted. External candidate, no hospital ties, full independence. Applications opened Monday." "Good," Sarah said. "I also want to ask you something." A pause. "Would you be willing to consult on the patient safety review, not as an employee, as an independent voice? The team we've assembled, they're good, but they don't have your institutional knowledge of what this place was and what it should have been." Sarah was quiet for a moment. "I'll think about it," she said. She thought about it for 4 hours. Then she called Lynn Park back and said yes. The federal hearing was scheduled for 6 weeks out. Senator Davis's office called Callahan to confirm that Sarah would be a primary witness. Callahan confirmed, then called Sarah, then very carefully did not tell her what to say or how to say it because he was a good attorney, and good attorneys know when their job is to clear the path and then get out of the way. The night before the hearing, Sarah did not sleep much. She lay in her own bed. She'd gone back to her apartment because she was not a person who hid from news vans and stared at the ceiling and thought about the morning that started everything. The gray Detroit sky, the sound of the city that knows nothing of the dramas happening inside it. The 12 minutes of lateness that she'd been cataloging, anxiously walking fast with her bag on her shoulder before the world redirected her. She thought about the pulse. 2 fingers on a woman's neck on a frozen sidewalk. Faint and skipping and absolutely stubbornly, magnificently there. That pulse had been Victoria Hall's refusal to die. and Sarah's hands had been the answer to that refusal. She thought about Kowalski 4 hours in the field hospital, the heat and the fear, and the absolute refusal to accept that doing everything right could result in losing someone. Kowalski was alive, had a wife and 2 daughters in Albuquerque, and sent Sarah a Christmas card every year with a photo that she pinned to her refrigerator and looked at when she needed reminding. She was not a person who was built to walk past dying things. That was the whole story. Stripped of the helicopter and the boardroom, and the federal hearing, and the trending hashtag, and the 17 hospitals, and the Senate subcommittee, the whole story was she was not built to walk past dying things, and a system had tried to punish her for it, and the punishment had failed. The Senate hearing room was larger than she'd expected. She had been in large rooms, hospital conference rooms, military briefing rooms, the kind of rooms where important things happen to ordinary people, and the size of the room is meant to remind you of the importance. She had learned in the Army to let rooms be as big as they were, and to be exactly as big as she was inside them, which was the only effective strategy. Senator Davis opened the hearing. Callahan was at the table beside Sarah. Morrison was in the gallery, civilian clothes again, but the posture that made the clothes irrelevant. Diane Marsh was in the press section. Angela Reyes was 3 rows behind Morrison, and she had brought Marcus Webb, and Jennifer Hart was there, and the 2 orderlies whose names Sarah had finally learned were Raymond Torres and Cal Sutton. And Raymond Torres had driven from Chicago, and Cal Sutton had taken a bus from Cincinnati, and they were all there, all in the same room, all of the quiet people who had been made quieter by a system that banked on their silence. Sarah looked back at them before she sat down. Raymond Torres gave her a nod that meant something she couldn't fully articulate, but didn't need to. It was the nod of someone who has been invisible for long enough that being seen feels almost physical. She nodded back, sat down, set her hands flat on the table. Senator Davis said her name. And Sarah Bennett, decorated combat medic, 12-year nurse woman who stopped on a frozen sidewalk because she was not built to walk past dying things, looked at the committee and spoke. She spoke about the sidewalk. She spoke about Patricia Cole's parking lot. She spoke about what it costs a person to be made into a liability for doing the thing they were trained to do. She spoke about the 17 hospitals and the pattern that wasn't coincidence, and the patients who deserved to know that the people caring for them were not afraid to say the difficult thing when it mattered. She spoke for 11 minutes, the same amount of time she'd spent on her knees on Larned Street. She thought about that after, about the symmetry of it. 11 minutes to keep a heart beating, 11 minutes to say the thing that needed saying in the room where it could do the most good. She didn't think it was accidental. She didn't think anything that had followed from that Tuesday morning was accidental. She thought it was the accumulated force of doing the right thing without calculation over and over until the universe ran out of ways to contain it. When she finished, the room was quiet for a moment. Senator Davis looked at her. "Ms. Bennett," she said, "on behalf of this committee, I want to say something that should have been said by an institution before now and wasn't." She paused. "Thank you for stopping." Sarah looked at her, and then she looked back at the gallery, at Raymond Torres and Cal Sutton and Angela Reyes and Marcus Webb and Jennifer Hart, at Morrison with his arms folded and his eyes steady, at Diane Marsh with her pen moving. "Thank you for letting us say it," Sarah said. 6 months later, the Healthcare Worker Protection Act was introduced in the Senate with 17 co-sponsors. It didn't pass the first session. These things never do. But it was introduced, and it was named, and it was in the record. And Callahan told Sarah on the phone when she asked about it that introduction is not the same as failure. That the first time something is said in a room like that, it changes the acoustics of the room permanently. Angela Reyes was 3 months into her new position and had already filed one formal concern through the external ombudsman process, the process that existed now that hadn't existed before, and the concern had been reviewed and addressed, and she had not been fired. Jennifer Hart was back in a pediatric unit. Different hospital. Better policies. She sent Sarah a text on the 6-month anniversary of the hearing that said only first day back felt like breathing again. Sarah kept it. Marcus Webb was consulting for a hospital system in Ohio on respiratory care protocols. He had been hired in the part because the hiring committee had read the Free Press article and recognized that someone who had risked his job to raise a safety concern was precisely the kind of person they wanted reviewing their systems. Patricia Hollins was still at Riverside Memorial. She had been called before the independent audit committee and had given a full account of what she had known and when she had known it and what she had and hadn't done with that knowledge. The account was honest and it was hard on her, and she had given it anyway. Sarah heard about this from Claire, who still sent occasional texts, and she thought about Patricia Hollins for a long time after that, about the particular courage of people who have made wrong choices and then choose differently when they get another chance. She sent Patricia a text. "I heard what you said to the committee. It mattered." Patricia responded 3 hours later. 4 words. "I'm sorry, Sarah. Truly." Sarah read it twice. Then she put her phone down, and she went for a run in the cold Detroit morning, and she ran until her lungs burned and her mind went quiet, and there was nothing left but the rhythm of her feet on the pavement and the February sky above her, and the city doing what cities do, humming forward, indifferent, alive. On the corner of Larned and 3rd, she stopped. She stood on the sidewalk, right there. The exact spot, or close enough to it, the city had no marker, no memory, no indication that anything had happened here. Just concrete, just cold air, just the ordinary, unremarkable geography of a Tuesday morning. She stood there for a moment and she breathed. Then she kept running. Because that was who she was, the person who stopped when stopping was necessary and kept moving when moving was necessary, and knew the difference between the two. The pulse had been there. She had answered it. Everything else was just what happened next. Orchestrated, seamless narrative continuation with emotional depth and dramatic pacing. Orchestrated, seamless narrative continuation with emotional depth and dramatic pacing. Tom Wheeler was not a man who called twice. Sarah had learned that in the first conversation, he had one speed, and that speed was forward. So when his name appeared on her phone again 40 minutes after their first call, she picked up before the second ring. "Change of plan," he said. "No greeting. I don't want a segment. I want an hour. Prime time? Live." Sarah was quiet for exactly 1 second. Live. Live. No edits, no producer cuts, no managed narrative. Just you, the story, and the people who lived it. A pause. "I've been doing this for 22 years. I know the difference between a story that matters for a news cycle and a story that matters. This one matters. I want to give it the room it deserves." She looked at Morrison, who was watching her from across the room, with his arms folded and his face doing the thing it did when he already knew what she was going to decide and was waiting for her to get there. "When?" she asked. "Friday," Wheeler said. 6 days. "I need Callahan's sign-off." "Already called him. He said it's your call." She almost laughed at that. Of course it was her call. It was always her call. That was the thing about the last 2 weeks. Every door that opened toward her, and every decision waited for her to make it. There was no one standing in front of her telling her what to do, which was terrifying and clarifying in equal measure. "Set it up," she said. She hung up. Morrison raised an eyebrow. "Live," she said. He let out a breath that was almost a laugh. "Of course it is." The 6 days between that call and Friday were the most compressed of Sarah's life since the desert, and in the desert time had compressed in a different way, the way it does when every hour carries the possibility of it being the last one. This compression was different. This was the compression of momentum of a thing that had started moving and was now moving faster than she had anticipated, pulling everything in its path along with it. Callahan called twice daily. The independent audit of Riverside Memorial's HR records had uncovered 43 terminations in 5 years that fit the pattern. 43, not 5, not 17. 43 people who had raised their hands and been systematically removed. The number landed in Sarah's chest like something physical every time she thought about it. 43. She called Angela Reyes. "Did you know it was that many?" Sarah asked. Angela was quiet for a moment. "I knew it was more than they said," she said. When I was still there before they let me go, you could feel it. The way people stopped talking in certain rooms. The way nobody used the internal complaint system anymore because everyone knew what happened to the people who did. Her voice was steadier than the first call, but there was still something raw in it that 8 months of unemployment and 2 months of vindication had not fully resolved. It becomes the water you swim in. You stop noticing it because you're too busy surviving it. "Come to Chicago Friday," Sarah said. "I want you on camera." A long silence. I've never done anything like that, Angela said. Neither had I, Sarah said. 2 weeks ago, I was sitting on my kitchen floor eating nothing and looking at overdue bills. You figure it out. Angela laughed, surprise, genuine, the laugh of someone who needed to laugh and hadn't had enough reason to. Okay, she said. Okay, I'll come. By Thursday morning, Sarah had confirmed 7 people for the Friday broadcast. Angela Marcus Webb, Jennifer Hart, Raymond Torres, Cal Sutton, Dr. Caroline Webb, who had spoken at the board meeting, and a woman named Teresa Kim, who had been a labor and delivery nurse at Riverside Memorial, fired 3 years ago, who had found out about the broadcast through the community board post and called Callahan's office herself. Teresa Kim was the one who undid Sarah completely on the phone briefly and privately, because Teresa Kim said in a voice that was very controlled and very careful that she had been told when she was let go that it was a staffing restructure, and she had believed it, and she had spent 3 years thinking she had done something wrong, looking backward through her own record, trying to find the mistake, and the moment she read Diane Marsh's story and understood what had actually happened, she had sat in her car and cried for an hour. Sarah held the phone and listened to this and did not say anything until Teresa was finished, and then she said, "You didn't do anything wrong. That is the only thing I want you to know before Friday. You did nothing wrong." "I know that now," Teresa said quietly, "but I needed someone to say it." Sarah held that thought for the rest of Thursday. She held it through Callahan's briefing call and Morrison's check-in, and the text from Donna that said, "You look tired in all the photos they're using. Eat something." And she held it into the evening when she sat at her kitchen table with a bowl of soup in a quiet apartment, and the understanding that the thing she was doing was not about herself, had never been about herself, was entirely and completely about the 43 people who had spent months or years thinking they had done something wrong. Chicago was cold and bright when they flew in Friday morning. The studio was larger than she'd expected and more ordinary than she'd expected. The way important places often are, the machinery of broadcast television, stripped of its glamour up close. Just equipment and lighting rigs and people with headsets moving with the specific focused efficiency of people who do this every day and understand that the show happens whether you're ready or not. Wheeler met her at the door, shook her hand. In person, he was shorter than his voice had suggested, with the kind of eyes that had seen too much to be surprised by things, but had not yet gone dead to them. "How are you?" he asked. "Ready," she said. "Good." He looked past her at the group, Angela Marcus, Jennifer Raymond, Cal Teresa, Dr. Webb, all of them standing in the corridor with the slightly dazed look of people who have been brought into a world they did not expect to inhabit. "I want to talk to them before we go on," he said. "All of them. 10 minutes. He gathered them in a side room and he stood in front of them without notes, and he said something that Sarah would remember for the rest of her life. He said, "I know most of you have spent time wondering whether your story matters enough to be told. I'm telling you now that it does. Not because of what happened to you, but because of what you chose to do about it. You chose to tell the truth when the truth was expensive. That is the only story worth telling." The room was quiet after that. Raymond Torres, who had driven from Chicago and who Sarah had learned was a man of very few words, said, "Okay then." And that was the whole of it. They went live at 8 p.m. Sarah sat across from Wheeler in the center of the set with the 7 others ranged in a slight arc to her left. Not as props, not as background, but as part of the conversation, which was how Wheeler ran it from the first question. He didn't start with Sarah. He started with Angela. "Ms. Reyes," he said, "take me back to the day they told you you were being let go." And Angela, who had been a patient records specialist at Riverside Memorial and who had spent 8 months believing she had somehow deserved what happened to her, sat up straight and said, "They called it a restructuring, but I'd filed an internal complaint 14 weeks earlier about access irregularities and patient records discrepancies that I thought needed to be looked at. 2 weeks after I filed, my supervisor started documenting my work differently, more closely, looking for things." She paused. "I understand now that that's called building a case. I didn't understand it then." Wheeler let that sit. Then he looked at Marcus. And Marcus talked about the staffing ratios he'd reported. And Jennifer talked about the overnight monitoring position. And Raymond and Cal talked about the medication management issue together, finishing each other's sentences the way people do when they've shared something they were both made to carry alone. And Teresa Kim talked about 3 years of looking backward through her own record, trying to find the mistake that wasn't there. And Dr. Caroline Webb last said, I raised concerns formally 18 months ago and they were buried. I've asked myself every day since the board meeting whether there was something I could have done differently that would have changed it sooner. And the honest answer is yes, I could have been louder. I chose the institution over the people inside it, and I have to live with that, and the only thing I can do with it now is be louder. The room that broadcast the unseen audience on the other side of the cameras was absolutely completely still. Wheeler turned to Sarah. Ms. Bennett, when he said, you stopped on a sidewalk because a woman was dying. You lost your job for it, and then everything we've heard tonight came into the light. He paused. Did you know, when you stopped, did you have any idea by him? No, Sarah said. I knew there was a woman dying on the sidewalk, and I knew I had hands and training, and I knew that 11 minutes was going to matter. That's all I knew. And if you had known what it was going to cost you, would you have stopped anyway? She looked at him directly, not at the camera, at him, because the question deserved a person, not a lens. I was a combat medic for 6 years, she said. I have sat with people in the worst conditions imaginable and held them together with training and will and the refusal to accept that the heartbeat had to stop. I did not go into nursing because it was safe or because it was easy or because someone told me it would be uncomplicated. I went into nursing because I am not built to walk past people who need help. She paused. So yes, I would have stopped. I will always stop. That is not a choice I make. It is what I am. The broadcast cut to commercial. In the 30 seconds before it came back, Wheeler leaned forward and said quietly enough that the microphones didn't catch it. That's the moment. Right there. That's what this whole thing is. Sarah nodded. She understood what he meant. She also understood that the moment wasn't hers. It belonged to everyone in the arc beside her, everyone who had stopped and been punished for stopping and had found their way to this room anyway. The call from Senator Davis's office came at 10:47 p.m. While Sarah was still in the green room after the broadcast, her shoes off, a cup of coffee going cold in her hand, Morrison sitting across from her, looking like a man who had run a very long operation and was allowing himself exactly 4 minutes of stillness before moving to the next thing. Callahan answered the call and put it on speaker without asking permission, which told her how significant it was. The aide on the line was brief and direct. Senator Davis had watched the broadcast. The healthcare subcommittee had been in discussion about a formal hearing for 10 days. The broadcast had moved the timeline. The hearing was being scheduled. Sarah would be asked to testify. So would Angela Reyes, Marcus Webb, and Dr. Carolyn Webb. When Callahan asked, 3 weeks, the aide said. When the call ended, the green room was quiet. Angela looked at Sarah. Her eyes were wide and she was holding herself very still, the way people hold themselves when they're managing something large in a small space. A Senate hearing, Angela said. Yes, Yes, Sarah said, because I called you on a Monday morning. Sarah looked at her. Because you were angry enough to call, she said. The Monday morning was just the logistics. Angela pressed her lips together, looked at the ceiling for a moment, then back at Sarah. I was so scared to make that call, she said. I almost didn't. I know, Sarah said. What made you think it would work? Any of it? Sarah thought about the question honestly, about the sidewalk and the pulse and the 2 fingers on a stranger's neck in the cold, and the 11 minutes in the paramedic's face and walking into the hospital with wet knees, knowing it was going to be bad. About sitting on the kitchen floor. About the helicopter in the parking lot. I didn't think it would work, she said. I just knew I couldn't stop. The Senate hearing was 6 weeks later. Not 3, these things always took longer than promised, which Callahan had predicted with the weary accuracy of a man who had navigated federal timelines before. Sarah used the 6 weeks. She consulted on the patient safety review at Riverside Memorial, which was where the second major twist arrived, the one that even Callahan had not anticipated, the one that reordered everything. The external review team had been working through clinical records when they identified something that had nothing to do with HR policy or employment practices or administrative retaliation. They found a pattern in patient outcomes, a specific narrow pattern related to staffing decisions made in the aftermath of 3 of the retaliatory terminations. 2 of the positions eliminated to build cases against departing employees had been night shift monitoring roles. And in the 18 months following those eliminations, there had been 4 adverse patient events on those shifts that the hospital had classified as unrelated to staffing. The review team did not classify them as unrelated. Lynn Park called Sarah personally when the preliminary findings came in. Her voice was controlled and steady, and Sarah could hear the effort behind both. "I need you to understand," Lynn said, "that what I'm about to tell you changes the nature of everything. This is no longer a labor case. It may be a patient harm case." Sarah sat down. "Tell me," she said. Lynn told her, 4 patients, 4 adverse events. 2 of them had recovered fully. 1 had sustained complications that required extended care. 1 had not recovered. The silence on the line between them was the heaviest silence Sarah had experienced since the desert. "Does the family know?" Sarah asked. She meant the family of the one who had not recovered. "The review team is preparing a disclosure process," Lynn said. With legal counsel within the framework of Lynn, Sarah's voice was quiet and absolute. "Does the family know?" A pause. "Not yet. They need to know before the Senate hearing," Sarah said. "They need to know before it becomes a news story. From the hospital directly with a full accounting, not a managed statement, a real accounting." She paused. "If this hospital is going to be what it's supposed to be, it starts with telling the truth to the people it has harmed, even when it is the hardest possible truth to tell." Lynn was quiet for a long moment. "I know," she said finally. "I know you are right. Are you bossy to do it?" "Well," Lynn said. And the word had weight in it, not political weight, not institutional weight, but the weight of a person making a moral decision in real time and committing to it fully. "Yes, we are." Sarah held the phone after the call ended, and she sat with the knowledge that had just arrived, the knowledge that the thing she had started on a frozen sidewalk had uncovered something darker and more consequential than wrongful termination, than systemic retaliation, than administrative corruption. It had uncovered actual harm, a life that was gone, a family that didn't yet know the full truth of why. She did not collapse under this. She did not look away from it. She held it the way she had learned to hold the worst thing steadily with both hands, and with the understanding that the holding was the only thing she could do until action became possible. She called Morrison. "I need you to come back to Detroit," she said. When no hesitation, not a single beat of hesitation. "Now," she said. He was there by morning. The Senate hearing was the most consequential room Sarah Bennett had ever been in, and she had been in rooms where people were deciding whether other people lived. She sat at the long table with Callahan beside her and Angela to her left, and Dr. Webb at the far end, and Senator Davis looked at her from the elevated platform with the expression of someone who has read everything and understood most of it and needs the human truth that documents cannot contain. Sarah gave her sworn testimony. She gave it without notes, without a prepared statement, in plain language, in the order that things had happened. The sidewalk, the pulse, the firing, the helicopter, the board meeting, Angela's call, the 43 names, the patient safety findings, the family. She spoke for 14 minutes. When she finished, Senator Davis looked at her for a moment before speaking. "Ms. Bennett," she said, "this committee has heard testimony from a great many people about a great many systemic failures. In my experience, systemic failures become visible only when individuals refuse to be made invisible." She paused. "You refused." "We refused," Sarah said, and she looked at Angela, and Angela lifted her chin, and Marcus Webb beside her sat a little straighter, and Jennifer Hart in the gallery pressed her hand briefly to her mouth and then took it away, and Raymond Torres did the thing with his eyes that Sarah had learned to recognize as everything he didn't say out loud. The Healthcare Worker Protection Act was introduced in the Senate 4 weeks after the hearing with 23 co-sponsors. The Riverside Memorial patient safety findings were disclosed publicly in a statement signed personally by Lynn Park. The family of the patient who had not recovered was contacted directly privately and given a full accounting before any public disclosure. Callahan told Sarah what he knew of that meeting, which was not much. It had been private, as it should have been, but Lynn Park had been present herself, and she had not sent lawyers alone, and that mattered. Linda Dawson's case was referred to the Michigan Attorney General's office for review of potential regulatory violations. Sarah did not follow this closely. It was not hers to follow. Other people were holding it. 41 of the 43 terminated employees were formally offered settlements, reinstatement, where applicable, and written acknowledgement that their terminations had been retaliatory and unjust. Sarah was not one of them. She had never wanted a settlement, and the hospital understood that by now. What she got instead was a conversation with Lynn Park about what Riverside Memorial intended to become, and a consulting agreement for the patient safety review, and a standing invitation to return. She thought about it for 2 months. Then she returned. Not because the hospital had earned her back completely. Institutions earn trust in years, not months. And Sarah knew the difference between a promise and a track record. She returned because Lynn Park was real, and the ombudsman was real, and the new whistleblower policy was real, and the patients in that building were real, and they needed nurses who would not walk past them. She returned because that was who she was. Her first shift back, she clocked in at 6:17 a.m. 13 minutes early. She walked past the cardiac wing sign with Edward Hall's name on it. She passed the nurse's station where Claire was already running charts and who looked up and said nothing. Just held her gaze for a second in the way of someone who was profoundly relieved by a thing they didn't allow themselves to fully want until it arrived. She went to her first patient, a man in his 70s, post-operative, anxious, alone in the room, in the specific way of people whose families live far away and couldn't come fast enough. He looked at her when she came in with the look of someone who has been in hospitals long enough to know that nurses are the variable that makes the difference between endurable and unbearable. "Good morning," Sarah said. She checked his chart, his vitals, his IV line. She moved with the efficiency of someone who knows every instrument and every reading and wastes nothing. And she looked at him the whole time the way she had always looked at patients, as people, not as charts, not as rooms, not as liability or cost or throughput. As people. "How are you feeling?" she asked. "Scared," he said, honestly, the honesty of someone who had decided in his exhaustion that there was no point in the other version. "That is okay," Sarah said, and she sat down, pulled the chair close, sat in it fully the way she had been taught long ago and had never forgotten. "Tell me what you're scared of. We have time." Outside the window, Detroit moved forward under a gray February sky, indifferent and alive, the city that had been the sidewalk and the helicopter and the board meeting and the kitchen floor and the Senate hearing room and every hard necessary thing in between. Inside room 4, 1-2, a decorated combat medic and 12-year nurse and woman who did not know how to walk past people who needed her, sat beside a frightened man and did the most important thing she knew how to do. She stayed. That was the whole story. That had always been the whole story. She stayed, and because she stayed, everything that was broken had a chance to be less broken. And that was enough. That had always been exactly enough.